and shut the camera off.
Okay.
We're live.
Okay, I'll move.
Okay. Christ is risen. Christos Christi. Today, the feast of Holy Apostle Thomas. I'm not going to talk about Thomas. We talked enough about him this morning. But I am going to touch a couple of subjects. And one of them, I was reading the Babylonian creation myth. When you read it, and also think about the biblical creation story in Genesis. There are a couple of things that strike you, and I'm certain I'm not the first person who's noticed this. I'm sure a lot of people have. But the book of Genesis may have had parts of it written down in earlier times, but as a whole collection, it was written in about 550 BC during the Babylonian exile. And we imagine, and a lot of people have already mentioned this, that it was written to keep the Jews from losing, the Judeans rather, from losing the context of who they were and where they were and the fact they were in exile, not losing their identity and melding into the Babylonian and Chaldean environment around them. We know that it wasn't written much before that because it misstates that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. The Chaldeans weren't even an organized tribe in the time of Abraham, and they didn't live in Mesopotamia. They were a Western Semitic group who moved into the Delta region about 900. They were a well-organized tribe by that time and formed a stable community. They gave one dynasty, short-lived dynasty as a matter of fact, to Babylonia in around the year 600 and began to build a new Babylonian empire. And they were identifiably Chaldeans. So that's when the Chaldeans actually would have been occupying Ur, not before 600 BC. So we have a good idea from that comment about Abraham coming from Ur of the Chaldees, about when the book was written, because the Judeans would have presumed that the Chaldeans were always there. When we look at the creation narrative, though, we find several striking things, as opposed to all the creation myths around that area in the Middle East, and perhaps most of the ones in the world. In the first place, in the scripture, there's God who creates. In the Babylonian Elishah, there are gods, and they create violently. They create with strife, and what they create is not necessarily good. It usually causes more problems and more stress. The Tiamat, the goddess of seawater, this is where probably the Muslims get the idea that seawater and freshwater won't mix, because throughout the Middle East in pagan times, there was a separate god of freshwater and goddess of seawater. Anyway, the goddess of seawater is sort of destroyed, and the top half of her is used to make the vault of the heavens, and the bottom half is used to make the earth. There's a whole genealogy of gods, and I believe Apostle Paul is going to mention this at a later time, where you have this whole genealogy of gods, of deities, of idolatrous images, and he tells people not to pay attention to these genealogies. The Gnostics were especially fond of having genealogies of deities. But anyway, the Judean story, the Hebrew story, which we find in the book of Genesis, features only one God creating peacefully, not violently, not with the destruction of others, but peacefully by his word and will. When he finishes creating, he looks at the whole creation and says, it's very good. And most of the creation myths is not very good. It causes more problems than existed before. It causes envy and strife among the deities. And also, when Margaret finally expels the old deities and takes over with his tribe, mankind is created as a slave for the gods. And the striking thing about the Genesis narrative is that God creates in his own likeness and image. They're not there to be slaves or even servants. They've been given a garden and told to take care of it. This is a striking difference between all the other Mideastern creation stories. And one might suspect, as I'm sure a lot of biblical scholars have suspected also, and other readers, that the creation narrative in Genesis was written as an antidote in opposition to the pagan creation myths, to acknowledge one God and a peaceful creation that was very good, and the creation of mankind in God's own likeness and image. You notice that the sun and moon aren't created right away. I believe it's, the fourth day or so, when the sun and moon are created. And I think there must be a reason for this. It's not necessarily that the writer of the story didn't know that the sun and moon were sort of necessary aspects of light and night and day, but that the sun and moon were major deities in many of the systems from the Middle East. They were worshipped as gods. The writer of Genesis wants to show, no, they're not. They're created things, just like the earth and trees and flowers and everything. They're created things. They're not something you can worship. They're not something you can deify. And even the animals, totems in Egypt, and several of the religions worship a golden calf or a god that was shaped like a fish. It was a combination fish-human, another sort of animals and things that were worshipped. The creation narrative in Genesis is saying, no, all these things were created by the one God. They're not deities, they're not to be worshipped. They're just things, created things. The sun, moon, the seven, what people thought were the seven planets at the time. These are all created things. Don't worship them, worship the one true God. And there's a Mishnah, a Jewish Mishnah that I once read on the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve. And the Mishnah says that God didn't create her from Adam's head, otherwise she would have lorded it over him. He didn't create it from his feet, otherwise he would have trampled on her. God created Eve from his side because she was equal to him to walk side by side with him. Not inferior, but equal to him, to walk side by side with him as a partner. There's another thing that is striking, and that is about the temptation story. Now, Adam and Eve are, if you read the narrative carefully, they're standing together, no distance apart. So Satan tempts Eve to take of the fruit. She says, but God told us not to partake of the fruit, not even to touch it. And Satan is convincing her, well, no, it's good for food. It'll give you knowledge, it'll give you wisdom if you eat it. And God just doesn't want you to have knowledge and wisdom. So Eve thinks it's over. She's sort of really thinking about it. And finally she yields and she takes the fruit, eats it. Now, a lot of people say, then she tempted Adam to take the fruit. No, she didn't. She didn't tempt Adam at all. She gave Adam the fruit and he ate it. There was no dialogue. She didn't sort of flip her hair at him or wiggle her hips or something. She didn't tempt him. She just said, here, this is really tasty. He gave it to her. He didn't resist. He didn't even spend as much time thinking it over as Eve did. He just acted much more impulsively than Eve and completely without temptation. He simply accepted the fruit and ate it. So let's get this out of our head that Eve tempted Adam to eat the fruit. She did nothing of the kind. He didn't need to be tempted. And he was standing next to her, so he must have heard the dialogue with the serpent, because she took the fruit, turned and gave it to him, meaning he was right there. Well, we can say Eve was first in transgression. Why? Well, it occurs in the New Testament, some places. I won't take the two books of Timothy, the two letters to Timothy and Titus, we know for certain were not written by Apostle Paul. So the idea about Eve and about women that occurs in the book of Titus is definitely not from Paul. There is an interpolation, and we're sure it's an interpolation, not something Paul wrote, in the letter to the Thessalonians, a brief reference that's completely out of place. And if you were to read it in Greek, you'd see that it's completely out of context. There was probably a margin note by some copyist that some later copyist saw it and incorporated it into the scripture. It happens that in different manuscripts it's incorporated at different places in the letter. So let's not be too hasty to blame Paul. It's clear that women figured in a big way in the Pauline church. You know, there you have Phoebe the deacon, and you also have women who hosted the congregation for the Eucharist. So we have to read the book of Genesis with a great deal of nuance. And this is the trouble with taking things out of historical context and pretending that they were written in the 20th century, the 21st century. The book of Genesis, the creation narrative, it seems to me anyway, and I know others will agree with this and have already noticed it long before I did, that the creation narrative in the book of Genesis, indeed a lot of the story in Genesis, is there to offset pagan mythologies and the idea that there were numerous gods who were all equal, all battling and fighting each other, who were all causing more chaos and demanding sometimes human sacrifices. So let's look at the book of Genesis, not in such a critical way, as in a thoughtful and nuanced way, and see maybe it's about something different than what we think it is. Maybe, of course, it's not historically accurate. We know that, and some of the early fathers were quite aware of that as well. But it's giving us a creation narrative that really counters all of the pagan narratives around it, all of the multitudinous gods around it. And that makes it a much more reasonable and logical allegory or story. It has a theological purpose, a theological intent. It's not just that it teaches us that Adam and Eve were undone by their ego. By falling into the ego, you eat of this fruit, disobey God, and you'll become like God. And it never dawned on them to say, well, but we're already in the image and likeness of God. What more do we want? No, you'll become like God if you eat this fruit, knowing good and evil and everything. So it was their ego that Satan was creating and then playing on. So they fell as much through their ego as anything else. In their ego, they lost their trust for God by wanting to be like God. And when they fell, the next story, the one about Cain and Abel, surely they both offered equal sacrifices, because God doesn't say to Cain, if you'd offered the right thing, I would have accepted it. He says, if you'd offered it rightly, I would have accepted it. And he can only mean that Abel offered from the heart as an act of love for God. Cain offered a sacrifice only because it was a law, only because it was the custom and tradition and something you had to do. But he didn't offer it from the heart. His ego was already at play in that. And then when he killed Cain, because Cain's sacrifice was accepted, that whole story is about Cain becoming overpowered by his own ego and killing his brother Abel because Abel's sacrifice was accepted and his wasn't. So his ego was wounded. And his ego swelled so much that he couldn't tolerate the existence of Abel as the one acceptable to God. And he rose up and killed him. That story and the story of the actual fall itself is informing us that ego is the root of almost all of our human problems. It's even national ego that causes war and that causes people to want to build empires. The egotism of the ruler, the egotism of the nation. That's really what war is all about. That really is what empire building is all about. The ego includes, well, how can we financially benefit from subduing and enslaving other people? How can we take what they have for ourselves? That, of course, is about ego. And that is the thing Satan uses the most often to tempt us with. Now, I could go on at length about the creation narrative, and perhaps in my book, The Creation and Fall, I'll go into more depth in it. But when we read it, let's don't just wave it off and say, well, this is, just an old myth. But don't think of the kind. It's actually a theological type document meant to offset all of the pagan creation mythologies around it and to acknowledge the one God who created the heavens and the earth. And that those so-called deities, the sun, the moon, the fresh water, salt water, all of these things, these are things, not gods, but things created by the one true God. And that's why the gods, the deities of the nations were represented by idols, by statues, but not the God of Israel, not the one true God who existed and everybody who followed him acknowledged in spirit. A God can't be a visible object, a created thing. And so that, to me, that's what the creation narrative in Genesis is trying to say. Everything that you worship in this world is just a created thing. But the one true God is the creator of all. And that's the real message in Genesis. The real message about the fall from Eden is the dangers of ego, leading to self-love, not self-esteem. Self-esteem is proper in a measured form, but into vainglory, the vainglory of ego, and the pride that comes with it. And that, the story is revealing to us, is at the root of all human tragedies and problems. And that's, I think we'll stop today. And next week, or sometime during the week, I want to make a recording about the culture wars that so many people are going into a frenzy and hysteria about, to the degree that they don't even preach the gospel anymore from the Solea. They're wandering about like some kind of Pentecostal hotfoot with raving about culture wars and telling you who you should hate, who you should be afraid of. I think that's demonic, because there have always been culture wars. When Israel went into Egypt, there was a cultural struggle between the children of Israel and the environment in which they lived to try to keep their perspective on God. When they came back into the Holy Land, there was a cultural strife between them and the Canaanites, the others idolatrous groups around them. When Alexander the Great formed his empire and took over Judea and left it to, when his empire dissolved into several empires, we all know the story of the Maccabee martyrs. There was great cultural strife, great cultural wars. And when the Romans took over the government, took over that area and incorporated it into the empire, there were even greater culture wars. There have always been culture wars. The shift from the Victorian era to the Edwardian era was cultural strife. The emerging culture after the First World War, the euphoria and optimism that came after the First World War, was a great culture war. The Roaring Twenties was part of a culture war. And then coming out of the Second World War, ending the Depression, which really the Second World War ended the Depression. You know, wars are very profitable to some people. They came out of, in the early 50s, we also had a culture war. So there's always some kind of culture war. But preaching about that in a kind of hysterical, fear-filled, and really hateful manner is not a solution. It's not a struggle against the culture wars. It's just a struggle to leave everybody unpeaceful, agitated, unsettled, full of fear or hate or both. So I think in our next video, we're going to talk about these culture wars, and I think a more calm and reasonable way, and suggest what we might do in response to some of the cultural struggles that we're having now. You know, there's a culture war even between Canada and the United States, for that matter, because we have two different cultures and we have two different approaches to culture. The United States approaches everything with fear, everything with fear and agitation and very often hate, whether it's Jim Crowism, racism, white supremacyism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. All of these things relate to fear and hate. And fear and hate are no way to proclaim the gospel, because the gospel is not about fear and hate. It's about something else. It's about healing rather than cutting the wounds deeper. So we'll make a video about that next. Well, thank you all for being with us, and God bless you all, and Christos Esquece. No, the other one.
This one?
That one. Push the silver button.
This one too?
Yeah, that one.